Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Dr. Karrieann Soto Vega is Assistant Professor of Cultural Rhetoric in the Writing, Rhetoric, and Digital Studies Department at the University of Kentucky. Mariana Fried, a doctoral student at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, and an affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Karrieann in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, and the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and institutions' history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Mariana will tell us more about Karrieann's research and career in just a minute. Then Karrieann will present her work, and after that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar at the bottom of the screen at any point in time. Mariana will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Mariana, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Pablo. It is my honor to introduce our guest speaker for today's seminar, Dr. Karrieann Soto Vega. Karrieann is an assistant professor of cultural rhetoric in the Writing, Rhetoric, and Digital Studies Department at the University of Kentucky. Her research and teaching spans Puerto Rican and Latinx studies, anti-colonial feminism, activism and social movements, performance, and sonic rhetoric. Today, we are very lucky that she will share with us a presentation titled Amplifying Autogestión and Cultural Rhetorics of Resistance, through which she will guide us through the practices of autogestión of Puerto Rican artistic collectives, such as Different Puerto Rico and Vueltabajo Teatro, as an opportunity to reflect on the power of amplification of collective action, and especially in relation to academic practices that engage colonial power dynamics. I'm really looking forward to hear what will for sure be an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. So I'm just going to give our guest a warm welcome. And for everyone in the session, keep in mind that throughout the meeting, you can write down your questions and comments by clicking on the Q&A icon in the bottom of the screen. Thank you very much, Karrieann, and whenever you're ready.
Hola, hola, hello, hello. I am so delighted to be in this virtual space with you all today. The Center for Latinx Digital Media has been a mainstay for me to wander into diverse projects featured from a multitude of disciplines, informing Latinx studies with emphases on digital media communication. So thank you so much for the invitation, Pablo, Facundo, Mariana, and everyone involved in the production of this seminar for the past several years, especially significant for many of us during the pandemic as we looked for connection to a world outside of our own little bubbles. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. All right. Before delivering my remarks, I should say that I have not forgotten the many peoples who have listened to and engaged with this work. It would take too long for me to name, but I should say from the start that my eternal gratitude goes to Eury Orsini and Zuleida Soto Roman, Raul Reyes, Frances Medina, and Mikey Cordero. These artists, activists, and their essential work are not a simple object of study. Instead, they are creating the movement that I aim to amplify. Today's talk is working from an article that is forthcoming in College Composition and Communication Journal, but this project has been developing for years, particularly the years in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. In the most recently published iteration, I was writing a 5-year anniversary recognition for the Whitney Museum of American Art. In No Existe un Mundo Post-Huracán, or a post-hurricane world does not exist, the artists and contributors to the catalog emphasized how the artists' cultural activist work featured was not exclusively tethered to the moment of climate chaos and catastrophe, but that instead chaos is fueled by colonialism. And as you can see in this slide, these concerns were highlighted by the passing of Hurricane Fiona in September of 2022, where it was just a Category 1 storm, but it still left many people without power or electricity. And they were still being charged hundreds of dollars for electricity that they weren't even using. Just a few months after, the first ever exhibit on Puerto Rican life by Puerto Rican artists at the Whitney opened in November of 2022. And this is the back of the catalog. In her opening remarks, the exhibit's chief curator, Marcela Guerrero, described how she was struck by the emotional weight of witnessing the impact of Hurricane Maria in September of 2017, and how from her diasporic position, she felt the urge to commemorate the moment somehow. As a curator, she had previously collaborated with fellow Latinx, Latine artists, but this time she wanted to do something for and with Puerto Ricans. As time passed, she recounted, she started reading the work of scholars writing about Puerto Rican artists and artistic collectives who addressed the tragedies that were wrought by the magnitude of the Category 5 storm. Taken together, the work of the artists, writers, and curators involved suggests that Puerto Rico's precarity and resistance is not exclusively tethered to a singular natural catastrophe, but to the catastrophic impact of colonial capitalism. This message was variously articulated and amplified in the exhibition and then in subsequent press coverage. After consulting one of my scholarly essays on how grassroots artists, activist collectives engaged in autogestión for Puerto Rican survival, Guerrero asked me to contribute an extension of that work in the catalog for the exhibit that I just mentioned. In the essay that Guerrero consulted, I explained how Vueltabajo Teatro, a transdisciplinary artistic collective in Western Puerto Rico, provided their artistic space as a hub for the collection of aid in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, but also how this kind of self-propelled solidarity work they defined as autogestión was part and parcel of their artistic activism before and after the storm. With the opportunity to expand that work, I focused on a second case study of artistic activism as autogestión in Defend PR, and how these two groups enact a Puerto Rican cultural rhetoric of resistance. As a theory and praxis, cultural rhetorics is an orientation to scholarly work that transcends the academy, work that concerns the rhetorical conditions necessary for a cultural group to thrive, and that is my definition. Some scholars have historicized cultural rhetorics as a field that attends to both culture from rhetorical standpoints and to rhetoric from cultural studies frameworks. A lot of cultural rhetoric scholarship addresses identity, embodiment, positionality, and/or institutionalization. while many scholar practitioners explicitly strive for decolonization and abolition. Methodologically, scholars of cultural rhetorics emphasize the importance of story and community-engaged work. Expanding conceptions of material cultural rhetoric in activism, or our role within such activism, I explore how amplifying autogestión by artist activist collectives allows for an approach to allyship that contributes to changing material realities for those involved. Although I explain the concept in more detail later, at this point I should note how autogestión has been theorized by Henry Lefebvre, or as my friend likes to call him, Lefebvre. Neil Brenner and Stuart Eldon suggest Lefebvre proposed it as, quote, a model of grassroots democracy or workers' control in the context of a wide-ranging analysis of oppositional socio-political mobilization in neighborhoods, cities, regions, rural peripheries, national states, and ultimately on a world scale. They explain further that autogestión was a kind of withering away of the state as Marx conceives it. Considering debates about the radical potential and perils of defining autogestión as apolitical self-management or as a type of liberatory mutual aid, and I'm thinking of Adriana Garriga Lopez, my friend and colleague and comrade, but I reflect on my experience writing about the work of artistic collectives that engage in autogestión as amplifying projects that call out corrupt governing practices rooted in systems of oppression while emphasizing and exercising the power of relying on each other. In their artistic activist work, Vueltabajo, Teatro, and Defend PR, grounded as it is in autogestión, both groups establish alternative modes of relationality and responsibility, key tenets of cultural rhetorics. And they enact disidentification in the Muñoz sense, particularly from the state. In my conception, autogestión is a counter-praxis of survival that imagines and enacts alternative relations and strategies of resistance. In what follows, I reveal how amplifying autogestión itself is a cultural rhetoric of resistance, particularly as it is coming from a diasporic Puerto Rican woman with deep ties in the Western area of the archipelago. And I explain how bringing that work back to the writing classroom encourages interdisciplinary perspectives where students learn about their relationality and responsibility to Puerto Ricans and other colonized peoples within the United States. First, I employ amplifying to, as Catalina de Onís writes, listen to and raise the volume of Puerto Rican voices that resist and refuse dead-end relationalities rooted in master logics that normalize extractivism and expendability. Second, I explain how autogestión provides a counterstance to a nation state's inability to secure the well-being of its peoples, a counter-praxis of survival in relation to conditions of crisis. Lastly, I describe how this work made its way to rhetoric and popular culture composition classroom and elaborate on students' responses. I conclude by attending to how amplifying autogestión is a necessary rhetorical strategy in a contemporary context of compounding crises in the post-pandemic neoliberal era. As a diasporican born in Orlando, Florida, and raised in San Sebastián, Puerto Rico, English was a subject I was easily drawn to throughout my public schooling. I'm an 80s baby who grew up on a media diet of MTV, VH1, as well as Contra el Reloj and Sábado Gigante. I cherish memories of listening to music in my room, dancing, creating mixtapes, transcribing lyrics, and later on attending and helping friends create flyers for local punk shows. In short, I have always been interested in cultural production. Across all my projects and seminar papers during my time at Syracuse University's Composition and Cultural Rhetoric PhD program, my intention was to provide a Caribbean-based Puerto Rican perspective to US-based academia. For me, focusing on anti-colonial efforts and decolonial praxis requires an understanding of the agency of colonial subjects. As I have learned, cultural rhetoric scholarship stresses storytelling as a significant epistemological and ontological expression. Particularly relevant for my purposes here is the work of Lisa King, who studies the formation and communication of Native American museums to argue for legible sovereignty. As she explains, quote, museum practices are rhetorical practices in that these institutions are always making choices about what stories to tell, how to tell them, and for whom to tell them toward a particular goal or consequence, end quote. I am drawn to Indigenous perspectives as intricately connected to the burning questions in my own scholarship, given that the systems we contend with demonstrate the impact of colonialism and emphasizes anti-colonial resistance manifested in a multitude of ways, while still prioritizing presence. In other methodological cultural rhetoric scholarship, there is certainly an attention to, as Sonia Arellano suggests, communities where you already have ethical and personal bonds, while at the same time being mindful of how limiting that could be. Embracing a humble position in relation to the communities we are a part of or passionate about entails acknowledging our limits. There is only so much that I or other scholars situated in the continental United States can do to contribute to the well-being of my peoples. Here I am referring to the geographic distance affecting the potential of understanding the breadth of the work needed to achieve justice, but also the limitations that academic work may have upon those communities featured therein. Therefore, from my diasporic position, I aim to highlight those whose work inspires my writing, while also attending to interrelational bonds with other cultural rhetoricians. This is especially pertinent for the context of Puerto Rico because of the potential for isolationist politics inherent in the Puerto Rican psyche, especially through insularismo. After all, it is a collection of islands surrounded by water, big water, as one former president of the United States asserted in response to his administration's inefficient disaster recovery response. Reflecting on the implications of including the voices of the subjects that are explored in my academic writing, I explain how amplifying autogestión aims to highlight the work that is already happening there in the Puerto Rican archipelago. It expands the reach of solidarity webs to include the diaspora and broader United States and Canada-based academics, as the Feral Feminism's publication is a Canada-based publication. Amplifying autogestión in North American publication venues outside of the related fields of rhetoric and composition results in anti-colonial education projects in the classroom, in the academy, and in other cultural venues such as museums. As I suggested previously, cultural rhetorics is an orientation to scholarly work that transcends the academy, work that concerns the rhetorical conditions necessary for a cultural group to thrive. But the question remains, how can we attend to geopolitics and cultural rhetorics and also engage in activism for social justice? The answer I am providing is amplifying autogestión. In Amplification by Counterstory in the Quantitative Rhetoric of Ida B. Wells, Daniel Liebert suggests that as an abolitionist and journalist, Wells used counterstory to amplify quantitative rhetorics in her retelling of lynching reports in the late 19th century. Liebert provides a synthesis of the ways that amplification has been conceptualized in rhetorical scholarship, particularly referencing Temptations McCoy. McCoy's tenets provided in her dissertation for amplification rhetorics are: 1, the reclamation of agency, ownership of embodied rhetorical practices; 2, the accentuation and acknowledgement of narratives, validated lived experiences; and 3, the inclusion of marginalized epistemologies that add to new ways of learning, all of which function as, quote, a theoretical framework for understanding another community's rhetorical practices, and also a way to showcase pride in the rhetorical practices of certain communities, end quote. Leibertz correlates Wells's rhetorical strategies with those used by contemporary anti-racist activists like those in the Black Lives Matter movement and Say Her Name campaigns. As an anti-colonial and anti-racist cultural rhetorician, I am attuned to creative critical scholarship, sonic rhetoric, and performance, especially attending to work by communities suffering the impact of compounding colonial crises. Much like McCoy, who focuses on agency, lived experience, and marginalized epistemologies, in my approach, I consider how we can amplify this kind of community-driven work. My work mainly focuses on the conditions that call for resistance in the Puerto Rican archipelago, but certainly also in other communities that have been disinvested from, discriminated against, and whose labor and lands have been oppressed by racialized capitalism, extractive economies, and death. And yet, as scholars who strive to form ethical bonds in the communities we feature in our scholarship, we ought to question the ways in which such scholarship can potentially enact a kind of extractivism, even without us intending to. And I've written about this in another publication I'd be happy to talk about during Q&A. Although the classical definition of colonialism suggests resource extraction, in the context of Puerto Rico and other colonized societies, extractivism often also entails outside scholars parachuting into and writing about communities in precarious conditions. Often we create initiatives and write articles and win grants with the hopes of garnering attention to a site or community that we deem lacking. But we don't necessarily follow through with the ways that such efforts may result in knowledge production for the sake of knowledge production. Of course, the more people know about Puerto Rico's colonial history, the better a chance for a widespread consciousness and concern about colonial capitalism's injustices to arise among diverse audiences. And this is a picture from an exhibit by Vueltabajo Teatro and Bemba PR, which is another collective, artist activist collective. This exhibit was held in Santurce's Ley 2018, which is a graffiti fest in San Juan. And this particular section was pointing to the students, the many students who were either displaced and migrated to the continental US or unfortunately lost their lives in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. In the next slide, you'll see another image from Vueltabajo Teatro's work. Across the various disciplines informing my approach, amplifying comes up as a strategy that necessitates an expansion of the areas where scholar activists published their work. For instance, in Amplifying Our Voices, feminist scholars writing for the public, Carrie Baker and her co-authors suggest that developing and amplifying one's public voice through writing for the popular press is an important form of activism for feminist scholars. In their presentation at the National Women's Studies Association conference in 2022, they further explained that their writing for Miss Magazine is a way of picking up the megaphone and saying what needs to be said. This literal application of amplification in terms of sound waves is similar to the ways in which it is used by editors and contributors of amplifying sound writing pedagogies, integrating sound into rhetoric and writing. In that volume, the concept of amplifying serves as a metaphor for what these teaching scholars want to do with sound in the writing classroom. The editors amplify sound as a prominent modality for and in writing instruction as they amplify the lessons from the featured writers. In both instances, amplification suggests expansion. For Catalina Dionis, who was featured here in a previous seminar, amplification involves strengthening rhetorical energy to achieve greater impact as activist scholars and practitioners increase the voltage of their rhetoric. In her award-winning book, she explains how, quote, amplification also can function as an enactment of voice. Caitlin Bruce also cites Dionis to refer to amplification in the context of mural graffiti writers in Ciudad de León, Mexico. Her chapter argues that, quote, the mural is a civic and affective form for amplifying attunement. Among the many resonances between Bruce's work and the context of Puerto Rico is how neoliberal governance results in resistance. In a similar key, Gio Maur's anti-colonial eruptions, racial hubris and the cunning of resistance also addresses how resistance is inevitable in contexts of oppression and how it demonstrates decolonial cunning by those most affected. And so here I want to talk a little bit of the decolonial cunning of folks in Vueltabajo Teatro, particularly through a post in the 2016 initiative of Colorea las Calles, where they took their artistic skills and put them into beautifying the spaces that were abandoned, whether because of disinvestment or because of displacement, right? And so they wanted to make it more of a welcoming space and therefore feeling a bit more secure, right? Ultimately communal well-being. The concept of autogestión, as I mentioned in the past, has roots in socialist worker activism in Europe and Latin America. It provides a counterstance to a nation state's inability to secure the well-being of its people. If the state's not going to be painting these common areas, we're going to go ahead and paint them, right? It does not pretend, however, to ignore the injustice wrought by the governmental neoliberal rule, prioritizing corporations over people. A lot of the actual artistic work is calling out their inefficiency and making fun of these politicians and so on. Autogestión is not simply self-management, and it does not necessarily always translate to mutual aid, though in some of these instances it does. In the case of Puerto Rico, autogestión is a response to compounding colonial crises, including what anthropologist Yarimar Bonilla calls the coloniality of disaster. Vueltabajo Teatro described themselves as un colectivo de artistas transdisciplinarios que adopta su nombre con la iniciativa de habitar y activar un espacio para la investigación y formación artística enfocada en el teatro como medio. In other words, their collective aim is to inhabit and activate a space for investigation and artistic formation, focusing on theater as the medium. And yet, they do much more than that, and much more than artistic formation, especially as they strive towards coalitions with other artists, activists, and collectives, and I would say also scholars and writers. Artistic collectives that engage in autogestión, such as Vueltabajo Teatro, call out corrupt governing practices while emphasizing and exercising the power of relying on each other. In so doing, they enact what the late queer theorist José Esteban Muñoz described as disidentification, a strategy of survival, particularly embedded in performance, that must imagine and enact alternative relations and strategies of resistance. This was quite evident in the way that Vueltabajo Teatro used their creative space to collect donations in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in 2017, as you can see in the slide. However, coalitional autogestión as a counter practice of survival is not exclusively tethered to climate catastrophe. It is a response to neoliberal capitalism used to remedy the inadequacy of colonial officials. And this is another image of the exhibit Isla Cancelada. They created these dollars that say the United States of America fiscal paradise. And of course, those are the vultures and the vulture funds trying to reap the benefits from the catastrophe that is in the background. Going back to Catalina Dionís, she discusses concerns of climate disaster exacerbating already entrenched vulnerabilities in Puerto Rico. She makes note of the 2017 Hurricane Maria catastrophe, but also the swarm of earthquakes in early 2020, Tropical Storm Isaias in the summer of 2020, and of course, the ongoing pandemic. More importantly, she writes about the work that was happening on the ground, featuring prominent voices within the archipelago. Adding to these accounts, in describing the work of Vueltabajo Teatro in the immediacy of Hurricane Maria's impact, as well as the ongoing work of reclaiming the common spaces like the ones that they painted, or the public plaza in downtown Maya West, where they hold a circo en la plaza, so a free circus for the communities nearby, to entertain and to provide psychological sustenance while rehabilitating abandoned spaces. Here, then, I am amplifying autogestión as relational counterpraxis of survival. Having coordinated efforts with Vueltabajo Teatro members to send in a collection of donated goods from my immediate scholarly vicinity in Syracuse, New York, in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, and in fundraising efforts in other scholarly settings, I was able to have a reflective conversation with the members of the organization about what autogestión means for them. The founding members reflected on how autogestión guides their collaboration with other artists and cultural groups to improve the well-being of the arts and general populace in the western area of Puerto Rico, due to the negligence of governmental and other artistic institutions that have been divested from due to neoliberal governments. These practices became essential for survival in the aftermath of the hurricane. Defend Puerto Rico, on the other hand, is a transmedia project designed to document and celebrate Puerto Rican creativity, resilience, and resistance. And that was a definition that I used when I had the last publication. But now, as you can see in the most updated website, they are opting out of resilience because, I'm going to read here, quote, "For far too long, we have used this word to describe our ability to survive through struggle. Resilience lets accountability be too malleable for the oppressor. We are tired of being resilient. That idea does not serve the people. We don't need our toughness measured. We need justice. We don't need our capacity to recover to be admired or our response to political disasters to be awarded. Staring at the face of adversity and having to survive before being able to exercise our right to thrive is violent." And still, they work across diverse media platforms, writing stories, designing and producing images and films that shine light on the detrimental situation in Puerto Rico, but also on how other artists and activists there are responding. In our interview, Mikey Cordero relayed that as a diasporic Puerto Rican in the 2015-2016 era, he felt there was a lack of media coverage about the problems faced by Puerto Ricans in the Caribbean archipelago, particularly around the debt. For him, the old San Juan black flag that was featured in my first slide in this presentation, don't worry, it'll come back, was a signal about the deadly conditions faced by many and by the nation writ large. He joined forces with other content creatives like Frances Medina, who had recently moved to the island-based Puerto Rican context and was looking for ways to engage in digital-based activism. Part of Defend PR's disidentification strategy is to emphasize citizenship rights-based injustices. Ironically, the same year that Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, it was the 100th anniversary of Puerto Ricans becoming United States citizens, 1917. Earlier that year, Defend Puerto Rico created an exhibit called City 100, where they and other artists reflected on the momentous occasion, taking stock of its benefits and its drawbacks. And this was an event held at the Clemente Soto Cultural and Educational Center in New York City. They focused on how the Jones-Shafrath Act of 1917, which provides citizenship to all Puerto Ricans, intersects with the similarly named Jones Act of 1920, both of which have established the legal economic provisions impacting the potential for survival based on goods not being able to enter Puerto Rico from neighboring countries eager to help in 2017. And this is particularly the case with the fact that the boats that enter the ports in Puerto Rico have to go or come from the US. So if, let's say, the Dominican Republic wants to send help, they would have to go up to Florida to then come back down. even though we're neighbors. This limiting condition is one of the many reasons that autogestión and mutual aid became so essential for survival. Instead of waiting for the state, mutual aid groups galvanized the Puerto Rican diaspora to acquire the material resources needed to survive, while also highlighting the complex fallout of governmental inaction. In the immediacy of the hurricane's impact, as I was collaborating with Vueltabajo Teatro and their associated Brigada Solidaria del Oeste, I was also signing and sharing petitions created by Defend PR, which included the temporary halt of fees and restrictions imposed by the Jones Act mercantile law. Yet long after the immediacy of Hurricane Maria's impact in 2017, I have continued to support these groups by amplifying their work in my scholarship, but also through social media networks, as well as materially supporting their efforts by providing monetary donations, participating in some of their events, and in using some of their films in particularly Defend PR's film made in the aftermath of the earthquake swarm in early 2020 in my visual rhetoric class. Incorporating the work of these artist activist collectives in a variety of scholarly endeavors meant that a variety of publics were being exposed to the kind of autogestión that was and is still necessary in the colonial context of Puerto Rico. Much can be said about bringing in our affinities into our classrooms as amplification, particularly attending to the intricacies of our approaches in discussions and course content that are traditionally meant for white audiences. And just for context, my PhD in Syracuse University was, of course, a predominantly white institution, and my current institution, University of Kentucky, is also a predominantly white institution. Due to time limitations, I focus here on a pandemic era course titled Activist Rhetorics in Popular Culture. For that virtual class, I assigned readings from a variety of perspectives and scholarly traditions addressing popular culture in a variety of media. Early in the semester, I assigned the aforementioned piece published in Feral Feminisms as a way to explain how students could engage in the assignment I called a consistent study, where they would focus on one person or a group that students considered activists, applying different theoretical perspectives we read throughout the semester. Reading my work not only gave students an idea of my own writing style, not that they were expected to replicate it, but also certainly an understanding of Puerto Rico's geopolitical position, particularly for all but the one who was herself Puerto Rican. Later in the semester, I introduced students to the final assignment for the course by assigning a piece I created for Journal of Multimodal Rhetoric's special issue on creative critical curation. One of the goals I had with assigning the piece was to showcase an example of curation for their final projects, but also to show how complex colonial and racial hierarchies manifest even within a majority-minority culture. Sounding out a rhetoric of resilience, curating plena in diasporican activism presents multiple scales of inclusion and exclusion, necessitating nuanced understandings of activism and popular culture that may be considered outside the purview of the United States. As an Afro-Puerto Rican musical genre that represented a kind of communication of the events of the day in the call and response form, and involves a portable hand drum, plena has become a traditional folkloric genre and is typically heard most during holiday celebrations, but also in protests. The student who signed up to present their reading of Sounding Out, a Rhetoric of Resilience to the class was a white woman who admitted to not knowing anything about Puerto Rico's political status and relationship to the United States prior to engaging with the text. A few of the screenshots included in her presentation featured the historicizing La Plena section's opening image next to the folkloric approach of Las Hijas de Boriquén in Houston, and an image of the Ricky Renuncia protest in the summer of 2019, presented towards the end to demonstrate how plena is protest. For the one Puerto Rican student in the class, it was a surprise for her to be able to consider how, quote unquote, her culture could count as popular culture. She focused her own discussion facilitation on the work of José Esteban Muñoz, addressing the art and life of Jean-Michel Basquiat, and the relationship the Haitian Puerto Rican New Yorker artist had with Andy Warhol. As evident in the following excerpt of that student's reflection, she perceived the course to provide a diversity of topics relating to rhetoric, popular culture, and activism. As evident here, students relied on material culture, typically the purview of entertainment industries, to explore their understanding of what counts as culture and what and how it becomes popular. More importantly, this and other student reflections show how students were pushed to rethink their own knowledge about perspectives others than their own. Resounding Puerto Rican activist rhetoric, therefore, prompted their thinking on rhetoric, activism, and popular culture as they are constrained, informed by, and or motivated by a metrics of privilege and oppression. Whether in teaching or engaging in cultural rhetoric scholarship that amplifies or draws public attention to issues facing our communities, honest conversations about privilege and oppression's complex overlaps necessitates reflection on the potential for extraction, even as we also acknowledge our inevitably marginal positions as insiders and outsiders, and or. Of course, besides amplifying autogestión in scholarship, published in a diversity of venues, we could also highlight how Puerto Rican artists have accrued cultural capital and chosen to use it to advocate for our communities. A prominent example is the case of Bad Bunny. And I featured one of the examples in the flyer for the activist rhetoric in popular culture course from his Tonight Show performance, featuring him as a presumably cisgender man wearing a skirt and a t-shirt that reads "Mataron a Alexa," to highlight the horrific murder of a trans woman in Puerto Rico. Another example would be the music video for El Apagón, featuring an investigative reporter doing a deep dive on gentrification and colonialism in Puerto Rico. I'll play a little bit of that. Okay, so if you haven't seen the entire 22, 23-minute long video, I suggest you do so that you can learn from Bianca Grolo's amazing investigative journalism. She connects these privatization efforts to gentrification and displacement. And so that is one big example of Bad Bunny using his position to amplify the struggles in Puerto Rico. And an especially important example for Latinx studies is this global superstar's consistent insistence on using Spanish for his songs, speaking to the resistance to English-only movements in the contiguous US and general Americanization efforts in Puerto Rico. That could also be thought of in terms of the fact that in his performance at the Grammys, I'm sure if you've seen it, you noticed and you saw the social media outrage about him being captioned as speaking non-English. Of course, there are t-shirts already. But I wanted to mention that you can hear the background, right? The kind of beat is definitely plena influence, plena and bomba being those two kind of coupled together. But in the actual performance, there were women dancing plena, like the ones featured in the previous slide. In terms of thinking of English only and what some scholars in rhetoric and composition call Black linguistic justice, April Baker Bell, for example, and also thinking of McCoy's work with Black communities, I should also note that there is another artist that engages in this kind of amplification.
Karrieann, I don't know if there's a way for you to change so that we can actually hear the sound, because
Okay.
we're not being able to hear it. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was, I thought you were hearing it. Okay, so you should watch this. If I play it any longer, I would just start to cry. She's basically amplifying the voice and the work and activism of 17 women and women of color. And so she mentions that being an icon is about what you do with that platform. And ever since the beginning of my career, this is Lizzo, I've used my platform to amplify marginalized voices. So while I'm not suggesting that in amplifying autogestión by Puerto Rican groups, I'm anything like Lizzo or Bad Bunny for that matter, I bring up this salient example to suggest further study into the ways in which cultural rhetorics can continue to amplify with accountability, to argue for amplifying as a methodology for social justice. So at this time, I thank you for your attention and welcome any comments or questions.
Thank you so much, Karrieann. It's been a privilege to hear this fantastic presentation. Now I would like to invite questions and comments from the audience. Please don't hesitate to write them down in Zoom by clicking on the Q&A icon. In the meantime, if that's okay, I would like to start with one question myself. Great. I was wondering if you could help us think about the role of trust in the practices of these collectives, which seems so central for allyship, coalitions, building trust with each other, but also trust from diasporicans, trusting them more than mass media or governmental institutions to distribute donations, and of course in relationship with scholarly work. So yeah, trust is often the biggest resource that many communicators dream of obtaining, and in the distance and in times of crisis, it seems even more difficult to build. So what were the strategies or lessons learned by collectives such as Vueltabajo about building that trust, that close community bond, despite being geographically distant from the diaspora, for example, and online very often?
I thank you so much for that question. It has been a concern, of course, of mine. I mean, that most of the talk today kind of gestured towards that. I think that due to the conditions that I mentioned, right, colonial capitalism, the fact that there's not a lot of support financially, there aren't any kinds of structures that already exist for them to be using their skills. A lot of them are, particularly Defend Puerto Rico, are communicators, right? They just decided to build it themselves. And to be honest, in terms of the practice of building that trust, for me, it has been years in the making. I know folks in Vueltabajo Teatro since when I was doing my master's back in 2006 ish. So, you know, I've been in these spaces with the same people. And so I feel like in the moment of crisis, climate catastrophe such as Hurricane Maria, it was certainly necessary to kind of have a all hands on deck approach. In the diaspora, we were participating in calls that were initiated by an activist in New York, Pablo, and I talked to people that I didn't know, but even US American white folks, right, who were in the area and were just, can I help in any way? And so I think that in these moments of crisis, right, it's like trust sort of has to be, we'll take any kind of help that we can get. But at the same time, with reflection, right, and I think learning from those experiences and the ongoing conditions of crisis make people realize that they can rely on each other, i.e. those who are in most close proximity. And this is where kind of place-based issues come to place. And I know that you are particularly looking at that. So I think that also for Defend Puerto Rico, it was in relation to that kind of support that I was already doing, but it was also because of a friend network, right? So I had a friend who knew a friend and so on. So that is that kind of proximity. I like to think about trust as proximity. And that's something that can be, of course, explored further. But those are my immediate thoughts. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for your answer. I think there's a question in the chat by Nicole. I'm going to read it out loud. It says, I'm wondering about what happens to autogestión and radical imaginaries become institutionalized and start seeking nonprofit funding. I'm thinking of different PR, who are all filmmakers and successful at that, whereas the CIMs seem to operate through donations that have not institutionalized. Also regarding Plena, can you talk on what's come out about Plena Combativa and how this Black Boricua genre has also been co-opted by white Puerto Ricans, and what happens to the protest spirit when harmed?
Oh yes, that's a big question. Thank you, Nicole. So I think that this is an interesting question in relation to the fact that I know that there is a lot of criticism to be made to the nonprofit industrial complex, of course. And of course, there's also this attention to how philanthropy comes into play as well. And I think that for both of these folks, in relation to their work being funded by philanthropies, it is the case where with the help of other academics and or, you know, again, in connection with initiatives that come out, the Mellon Foundation has been able to grant some fellowships to both of these groups. And so they're using them in different ways. I know that Defend Puerto Rico is trying to create a hub for other content creatives that are in Puerto Rico, right? To come together and unite their forces, right? So that it's not like they're all doing similar things. I'm thinking particularly of Consentimiento, which is a woman who is using her platform online to discuss issues about gender violence and consent. And she's also going to schools now, right? Because she's established a platform. So I think that you can see the creation of these groups who are content creatives and are trying to educate in a activist sense and do the work that, again, a gender perspective in education has been debated in Puerto Rico. I mean, of course, this is an issue in the contiguous US as well, right? And so regardless of that, these folks are like, okay, no, we need to still do the work that needs to be done, right? And so they're using social media platforms for that. In my opinion, it is somewhat inevitable to be able to function without money because we live in a capitalist society. And so the fact that then they are using those monies, right, to continue to expand and build these solidarity webs, I think is really important. I would rather see these groups building these hubs than, let me just say, Ricky Rosselló getting book deals, for example. And Ricardo Rosselló was the previous governor of Puerto Rico who was ousted, right? Who has a book deal. And so this is the kind of situation that I'm thinking of. And then, of course, in order to be fed, you need money, right? And so I'm just trying to think about what ways we can do the kind of critique that is necessary, but also be realistic in the sense that this is important work. And they are highlighting areas, particular geographic areas that are not usually the main focus in scholarship and or news, right? about Puerto Rico. And then in terms of the Plena Combativa, I am very aware. There was this issue, and I think I tried to kind of get at that in my publication on Plena as resilience, quote unquote. It was very much still attending to why do we need to still talk about resilience? But yes, and so particularly in that slide where you have Las Hijas de Boriquén, you know, they are mainly white Boricuas and hypersexualized, right? And so, but that is the kind of nostalgic memory that and cultural work that a lot of folks in the diaspora are drawn to. And so, of course, then thinking of Plena Combativa's issues, and these are interdynamics, right? In intra-group dynamics. The fact that there was this one Black Puerto Rican woman who was discriminated against within the group, and the group itself didn't listen. And so therefore they, after taking a hiatus, they've recently decided to stop being a group because they acknowledged that they engaged in violent and racial behavior, racialization of their own group member, right? And so I think that it's commendable, and I'm glad that they made it public so that people can be more, again, mindful. And how did I know about that? Through a social media post. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Nicole. I would love to have a larger conversation, but that's because it's a complicated topic. But thank you for your question. I hope that answers.
Thank you, Karrieann. And I think there's a minute for Val's question.
Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation, Professor Soto Vega. Your scholarly approach to amplification as a tool through the lens of artist protest is absolutely fascinating. And I think it's a lens that not many take, but I think it's crucial for the larger meaning formation process and global artistic practices. So thank you for that. Really considering the collective nature of the work to tell the story of community, I'm wondering if you saw a larger degree of amplification through digitally based work, or was this more deeply rooted within the work that could be experienced within the community's physical context? And also, what have you perceived to be the role and impact of technology in the artistic practices of these activists and their processes of amplification? Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, so I do see that the Defend Puerto Rico collective is certainly a digital-based community, right? That's what they do. At the same time, they're also filmmakers. So they go into the communities and they have conversations with the community members that were impacted. I suggest you check out their website, check out the movie Temblores, hire them, bring them to your universities, pay them to screen their movies. There's one by the other, Fantausi, the other member that I have not been able to speak with, but have been following as well. And we still hear, and it's about the mutual aid that happened in a rural mountainous town of Puerto Rico. So that's one of those mostly digital, but also film-based and all that entails. With Vueltabajo Teatro, it's also very much rooted first and foremost with the community and the place. But at the same time, they've also expanded. They have their own website, and they also recently have started having a radio program in the local station, you know, in Mayagüez. So they are definitely making use of that. And of course, again, social media to make their announcements about events and about anniversaries. Their Taller Libertad, their creative space is 6 years old. And so they're having those kinds of, again, amplifying their own work there. But I would say also just to kind of end with how they use that space, that physical space to nurture other kinds of art, artists. So Lisette Roman is a singer-songwriter who filmed her performance for consideration for Tiny Desk at the Tiny Desk concert, right? The NPR contest that would kind of propel her to a larger degree of a platform, right? So again, there is definitely a great interplay between different kinds of technologies, sonic, visual, but also always rooted in the connections that they're making with the people that that are doing so much for the place themselves. So yeah, thank you. I hope that that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Karrieann, for a fascinating presentation. Thanks again, Mariana, for terrific moderation. Thank you to our audience for staying with us through the end and a little bit past the end. I want to invite everybody to join us for the next weekly virtual seminar on Thursday. And once again, Karrieann, thanks a lot. This was excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye now.